One of the other operations that dplyr allows us to do is to select columns. Dplyr, after all, is a package that allows us to transform data and filter it, select columns, select rows, and create new columns, allowing us to really transform data in significant ways. And one of the things it allows is the selection of rows and selection of columns. The way that we select columns using dplyr is to use the select function. Again, working with the pipe operator and working with the CO2 per capita dataset, I shall say CO2 PC is going to store the result of read_CSV data from CO2 per capita .csv, and consequently I'm going to pipe this to the gather function because this data is in wide form. I'm going to minus country and specify that the key value is equal to year and the value column is equal to CO2 per capita. To select specific columns, what I would need to do is to identify the columns that I'm interested in. At the end of the gather process, I would have 3 columns: country, year, and CO2 per capita. Let's say that I'm not actually interested in the country column. I'm only interested in the year column and the CO2 per capita column. Consequently, what I can do is I can use, again, the pipe operation to pipe the results of this gather to the select function. The select function allows one to select columns we are interested in from the resulting gather operation. The columns I'm specifically interested in is year and CO2 per capita. One obviously has to make sure that the names that one is using as part of the select correspond to the names that actually exist in the data frame after the gather operation. Once I run this, I have a new type of CO2PC, and if I take a look at the head of CO2PC, I see that CO2PC no longer has the country column, but only has the year and CO2 per capita columns. This way, one can select columns based on the names of columns. However, that's not the only way one can select columns. One can also select columns based on column positions. If one wants to select based on column positions, I shall take the entire same process once again. I should go through the entire process once again, but in this case, instead of selecting based on year or CO2 per capita, I shall be selecting based on a column position. Let's say I only wish to have the first and the third column. So I'm going to say 1, 3. And if I run this, I shall be getting only the country column, which would be the first column, and the third column, which is CO2 per capita. If I run this and take a look at head of CO2PC, you will see that I only have the country column and the CO2 per capita column, which is the first column and the third column. I do not have the second column, which is year. So one can also select columns based on column positions, and this is especially useful if one has a data frame with a lot of different columns. And so instead of listing out the names of the different columns, one can list out the specific column positions that one is interested in. In addition to selecting names based on column, in addition to selecting columns based on column positions, one can also use functions to determine what columns one is interested in. I can also select columns based on patterns in column names. Keeping with the same logic, again, working with CO2 per capita as our example, we are reading data in from CO2 per capita .csv, gathering the column, but instead of selecting based on specific column names, I'm going to be looking for a pattern. In this case, my pattern would be, let's say I'm interested in those columns that start with a certain character. Let's say I'm interested in those columns that start with the letter C. Country starts with the letter C, and CO2 per capita starts with the letter C. If I run this, notice that my head of CO2 PC now has, again, only the country and CO2 per capita because they both start with the letter C. In this way, one can use the select function to identify specific columns that one is interested in a data frame.